I wasn't this nervous before the other talk. This one, I don't know. Once again,
there was alcohol at that one.
There was alcohol at that one, but this one also is being streamed.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to be mic'd up. Once I switch it to live. Okay.
Welcome to our last Coffee with the Curator for the year. A big thank you, as usual, to our sponsor, the Spice Merchant, who donates a pound of coffee every month for this event. And today we are drinking Bali Blue Moon. Bob over there, the owner, has been a huge help to us, and he always has good recommendations for coffee. So big thank you to the Spice Merchant. Also, quick announcement, we have our holiday sale for the end of the year. From now until we close for winter maintenance after the 29th. Everything is going to be 20% off, merchandise and memberships as well. So it's a great time to renew those memberships if you haven't already, or get some holiday gifts for people. On January 16th, our first speaker of 2025 is going to be Professor George Diener, a world environmental historian at Wichita State University. Professor Diener will be drawing from his expertise on pandemics and public health history to give a presentation called Bird Flu, Concern or Curiosity, about the ongoing avian flu cases, with an eye to discussing whether these cases represent a true issue of concern to the public health or merely an odd event. So mark your calendar for January 16th, and remember that since we will be closed for our winter maintenance for the beginning of January, for those of you who go to our Senior Wednesday programs, we will not have a Senior Wednesday at the start of January. So Coffee with the Curator, January 16th. Today, we have the Museum of World Treasure's very own Taylor Ubert. Taylor is the Assistant Store Manager in the museum's Operation Department. Prior to working here, Taylor served in the Navy for just under 9 years as a supervisor and mechanical technician in the nuclear-powered engine room of the USS George H.W. Bush. While in the Navy, he satisfied his love of history while stopping in ports overseas, visiting many historical sites from Europe to the Middle East. He is currently working on his bachelor's degree in both history and anthropology, which he will graduate with in May, and he has plans to continue his studies focusing on Southeast Asian history. Please give a warm welcome to Taylor Ubert.
Thank you, Keenan, for that lovely introduction. Many of you who are sitting here today have probably seen me before, although it was downstairs checking you guys in, so it's nice to see you from this side of the podium. So as Keenan said, I am a veteran of the Navy, 9 years. I started my service up in Great Lakes, where everybody enlisted is in the Navy starts. I did 2 years of training in Charleston, South Carolina at NMPTC and then NPTU Charleston, just down the road, which I will talk a little bit about today. In 2016, I was assigned to George H.W. Bush for 4 years, where I deployed in 2017 in Operation Inherent Resolve to the Mediterranean and to the Persian Gulf. In 2020, I became a recruiter, came back here, recruited for the last few years, and got out just a couple of years ago. So as he said, I am studying history and anthropology, and today I'm going to talk to you about the history of the nuclear navy. So let's start at the beginning. The atom, derived from the, real quick, I do have a disclaimer before I get further into this. If it sounds a little scripted, it's because it is. I had finals last week, and I did not have the mental capacity to commit all this to memory, so please bear with me. All right, back to it. Well, let's start at the beginning. The atom, derived from the Greek word atmos, meaning uncuttable or indivisible. The atom is the basic particle of matter as we know it. Sure, there are smaller particles that make it up, and these are extremely relevant to today's topic, but the atom will be our standard unit of measurement here. In the early 19th century, John Dalton would become the first scientist to produce evidence of the existence of atoms, and over the next century, the sciences surrounding the atom would be fleshed out. Prominent figures such as Marie Curie, Niels Bohr, Ernst Rutherford, and Albert Einstein, to name just a few, were all crucial to developing our modern understanding of atomic sciences. And I apologize, I know I just breezed through about a century's worth of science history, but for the sake of time and my sanity, we'll keep it at that. Flash forward, in 1938, a team of German and Austrian scientists consisting of Otto Hahn, Fritz Strassmann, Lise Meitner, and Otto Fritsch discovered the process of fission and published a paper in Germany regarding the potential uses for their discovery. A proposal letter was written and sent to the Wehrmacht High Command as war in Europe loomed. The race for an atom bomb was on. So the Second World War would bear some similarities to the previous war. U-boats would prowl the seas, planes would buzz the skies. But unlike the Great War, the technologies that were in their infancy had come to maturity in the intervening years. Hitler's wolf packs were far more advanced than their predecessors, and air superiority had made many technologies obsolete, as demonstrated by the attacks on Pearl Harbor, Taranto, and at the Battle of Midway. Sonar and radar were refined to give an edge to these offensive capabilities, and German rocketry had brought a whole new aspect to the conduct of war. And lastly, there was the biggest change of all. On July 16th, 1945, at approximately 5:30 in the morning, just outside of Alamogordo, New Mexico, the world entered the atomic age with the detonation of the Trinity device. Just under a month later, on August 6th and August 9th, the world would be made aware of the destructive power of the atom with the leveling of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The program that gave birth to such a powerful weapon was named the Manhattan Project. And in 1939, with war imminent, and in response to the German team's discovery of fission, Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard, who had come to the US to work, penned a letter of warning to the American government about the potential of a Nazi atomic weapon, and advocated for the US to do everything in its power to utilize the wealth of scientific talent in the country to beat Germany to the bomb. He got his friend and colleague Albert Einstein to co-sign the letter, and it was then delivered to the Roosevelt administration. Thus, the Manhattan Project came to be, and a frenzied dive into all things atomic by scientists across the US began. J. Robert Oppenheimer is perhaps the most well-known figure of the Manhattan Project, but it is the work of Italian physicist Enrico Fermi that is more pertinent to our story today. Fermi had fled fascist Italy to protect his Jewish wife and had found work at Columbia University. At the beginning of the Manhattan Project, he moved his work to the University of Chicago, where he set about developing an artificial reactor to study fission and its uses. Achieving initial criticality on the 2nd of December, 1942, Chicago Pile 1 became the world's first artificial nuclear reactor. While it and follow-on experimental reactors were used to produce the plutonium that was essential for making bombs, they also served as testbeds for other aspects of nuclear research, to include the use of fission as a means of energy production. Fermi's team proved this by using the reactor to light a series of light bulbs, and though this was a minor demonstration, the test would eventually prove to be the beginning of an endeavor spearheaded by the lead character of our story today. While the history of the nuclear navy is composed of thousands of men and women across almost 8 decades, there can be no denying that any discussion of the Navy nuclear program could not happen without first talking about Admiral Hyman G. Rickover. Though this will be far from a comprehensive biography of the man, there have been many such works on the subject, and I encourage you all to read about the father of the nuclear navy. One such work that has guided my research was a recent publication by Mark Wortman entitled Admiral Hyman Rickover, Engineer of Power. Some interviews that he gave on his book, like I said, helped guide my research for this presentation today. So, born to a Jewish family in Russian-occupied Poland at the turn of the 20th century, the Rickovers faced anti-Semitism that was rampant in Europe at that time. Rickover's father, Abraham, would journey to America in hopes of a better life, and to make enough money that he could send for his family to join him. By 1906, Abraham had done just that and brought his wife and 2 young children through Ellis Island into the United States. They lived for a short time in New York City before ultimately settling in Chicago, where Abraham worked as a tailor. Hyman, ever the dutiful son, worked to help support his family between his studies, and though he was never a star pupil by any stretch of the imagination, his penchant for hard work and determination would serve him well as he grew into an adult. Being of limited means, the Rickovers would have had a hard time indulging Hyman's dream of attending college, though through a family connection, Rickover was able to attain an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy in 1918 as a member of the class of 1922. During his time at the Academy, he did face discrimination due to his Jewish heritage, but not all of his hardships were a result of prejudice. He established for himself a reputation for being a no-nonsense, average, but hard-working, if somewhat antisocial character amongst his classmates. He refused to attend many social functions, and he often studied hard into nights and on weekends. His first posting after graduation was the destroyer Lavalette, where he quickly distinguished himself by his hard work and efficiency. You're going to see a trend here, I'm telling you. He would carry his single-minded work ethic to the battleship Nevada before beginning a master's program at Columbia for electrical engineering. At Columbia, he faced a different kind of education than what he had been served at the Academy and would have profound effects on the programs he would go on to establish. Following his degree, Rickover volunteered for submarine duty, an all-volunteer force to this day, and was assigned to the S-9 and S-48 where he earned his fish. That's Navy jargon for submarine qualifications. During his time aboard these two boats, he became intimately familiar with the realities and limitations of diesel-electric engines, which would serve as the material for his inspiration after World War II, which I will come to shortly. In 1937, he was assigned to his one and only seagoing command, the minesweeper Finch, but he only held command for about 3 months before becoming an engineering duty officer, that is, an officer whose primary job is not to command ships, but rather to specialize in engineering. With this shift, he was transferred to the electrical section at the Bureau of Ships and became its assistant chief in 1939. When the war broke out, Rickover ended up leading the section and was responsible for coordinating all manner of repairs around the fleet. Late in the war, he was tasked with setting up a facility on Okinawa in preparation for the invasion of Japan, but this soon proved irrelevant with the dropping of the bombs. In I missed a paragraph. With the war over, a world out of tenuous peace saw the shrinking of the military budget, with the lion's share of funds being funneled to the new atomic weapons program, headed up by the soon-to-be-established independent branch in the Air Force. Rickover was recalled to Washington, but he wouldn't be there for long before he got his next assignment. Now the next slide. In 1946, in an attempt to get a slice of that nuclear pie, the Navy assigned a team of 5 officers to travel to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to see what applications his new power source could hold for them. In a world of nuclear weapons and air superiority, the Navy would need to find a way to become atomic to stay relevant and not go the way of the battleships at the beginning of World War II. Rickover, by now a captain, intrigued by the prospect, found himself a part of the team of Navy officers and quickly established himself as the leader of the small cadre. Though prospects of usable power generation had been shown with Chicago Pile 1, at Oak Ridge and other laboratories across the country, the focus was on weapons. Nuclear power was deemed a future project with current technologies, hinting that the application would not be practical at that time. Rickover saw things differently. The utilization of nuclear power was merely a matter of engineering to him, and given the choice between weapons and power, he would choose both. He would utilize nuclear power to create a new weapon to keep the Navy in the game. In nuclear energy, he saw the solution to issues he had experienced during his time on submarines. The issue with submarines up until that point in history was that they were effectively surface ships that had the ability to operate underwater for a short amount of time. On the surface, they could run their diesel engines to drive the boat, but underwater they had to rely on large, clunky batteries to power an electric motor. The charge on these batteries could last anywhere from a few hours to a few days, depending on the required speed of operations. And when the battery was spent, the submarine would have to surface, light its diesel engines to recharge the battery, where it would essentially be a sitting duck. What if, however, you could power the submarine indefinitely underwater? A submarine that didn't have to surface would be a terrifying weapon indeed, and for Rickover, nuclear power was the key. Wrong direction. Still wrong direction. Where am I going? Aha, here we are. Rickover would be recalled back to Washington, where he would begin stubbornly lobbying for the creation of a division in the Navy to develop such nuclear technologies. Given his reputation of being widely disliked by his peers and superiors, his efforts were stalled, but he was not deterred. It didn't help that in 1947, the Atomic Energy Commission was under the assumption that Congress and the public would only support the creation of weapons, not power. In 1948, as something of a last-ditch effort, Rickover appealed directly to then Chief of Naval Operations Chester Nimitz, a career submariner and previously commander of Pacific Forces during World War II. Nimitz was won over by the ambitious captain and penned a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, who agreed with his chief, and he directed that a nuclear division in the Bureau of Ships be created for the development of nuclear technologies with Rickover in charge. With a little more lobbying, Rickover was able to get the Atomic Energy Commission on board, and a naval division within the AEC was created. Though Rickover had few friends in Navy leadership, he had more than luck with dealing with civilian administrators, and he was able to secure for himself the lead position at the AEC's Navy branch as well. This would become Naval Reactors. Rickover was given an old rundown office building on Constitution Avenue, dubbed Tempo 3, and he was set about creating an austere but energetic department of nothing but the best and brightest engineers dedicated to developing their new nuclear program. Ever the contrarian, Rickover insisted that he and his staff not wear their uniforms so as to not have the specter of rank clouding the open and direct discussions he wanted his people having. The virtues he would end up instilling in his division would end up being summarized in what are today's nuclear watchstanding principles of integrity, ownership, formality, high level of knowledge, having a questioning attitude, maintaining procedural compliance, and when you see something wrong, forceful backup. With his kingdom established, Rickover and his team set about the development and testing. And in 1949, the Atomic Energy Commission announced that it would construct a reactor testing station in Idaho at the Naval Proving Grounds. And in 1953, a submarine thermal reactor dubbed S1W, S for submarine, 1 for first generation, and W for Westinghouse, would come online to serve as the first prototype for the then under construction USS Nautilus. The facility would grow, the facility would continue to train Navy engineers and technicians well into the 90s and is still a research facility to this day. Which brings us to the Nautilus itself. The culmination of years of blood, sweat, and tears and the proof of concept that Rickover had been arguing for was commissioned on September 30th, 1954. The Nautilus would sit pierside for a few months undergoing some final testing and construction, but on January 17th, 1955, Commanding Officer Eugene Wilkinson would take his new command out to sea for the first time, transmitting the words, "Underway on nuclear power." During her shakedown cruise, the Nautilus would break several endurance records and would continue to rack up more achievements in the succeeding years. To begin her career, she traveled submerged 1,381 miles from New London, Connecticut to Puerto Rico in under 90 hours, to that date the longest underway voyage by a wide margin. In August 1957, she would sail under the Arctic ice pack, a feat which was considered too dangerous for conventional boats due to the inability to surface and recharge its batteries. The strategic implications of being able to travel over the top of the world as the Cold War grew were immense, drastically cutting the distance to the Soviet menace for strategic naval assets. To top this new ability off, in 1958, the Nautilus would travel and operate at the geographic North Pole during Operation Sunshine. The Nautilus became so much more than a proof of concept. It was a startling success, for which Rickover gained fame across the country and the world. Even before the Nautilus was completed, he was featured on the cover of Time magazine, and he was quoted there saying, "Sure, the scientists can think up thousands of reactors, but the Navy wanted a nuclear submarine, and it wanted one fast." He knew his initial triumph was far from perfect, but clearly his experiment worked, and more were to follow. At the height of his success in the public eye, however, Rickover faced challenges within the Navy. As mentioned earlier, his stubborn and prickly nature did not sit well with many of his colleagues and superiors, and just before the launch of the Nautilus, a promotion board was convened to elevate captains to the rank of Rear Admiral. Rickover was considered, and he was passed over. Despite the success of the Nautilus, a second board was convened with Rickover once again being considered and once again being passed over. Per regulation, he would have been made to retire within a year of being snubbed this second time, but word made it to Congress, and they were none too pleased. You see, during his time lobbying for his program, Rickover had made many friends on Capitol Hill. Senators and congressmen considered him their man in the Navy, and he played this up for all it was worth, famously never appearing before them in uniform, demonstrating that he was not beholden to the good old boys club that the Navy brass was at that time. With Congress on his side, they threatened to interfere with the Navy's selection process for flag rank. Wanting to maintain their autonomy and an ounce of decorum, the admirals convened a third board rather than overturning the decision of the previous one that had considered Rickover. The requirements for the board were such that only one candidate fit that role. Rickover would become an admiral, and he would later joke that the board might as well have said they were looking for a 5'6", 125-pound Jew with how specific they were. With his position secured, Rickover could now build and enforce his nuclear navy. To lead it, he developed an intense officer selection process that has become infamous for its unorthodox methods. The highlight of it was a one-on-one interview with the director of naval reactors, Rickover himself. His intention was to place highly vetted candidates in unusual and stressful positions
to see how they would react. Would they conform, or would they show a spark of ingenuity? And so, we're going a little bit off script here to talk about some of the examples of his interview methods here. Starting off, one of the most famous things he did was he would take the interview chair, which was a slick-sided wooden chair, cut about 2 to 6 inches off the front legs of the chair so that it would lean forward, and force his candidates to sit down while he proceeded to grill them with questions. Being in such an uncomfortable position while having the admiral scream at you is probably not the best thing. And if you told him an answer he didn't like, he would banish you to the broom closet for a few hours, let you stew on what you said, bring you back out. If you were able to figure it out and say the right thing this time, he may pass you. Otherwise, he might banish you back to the mock closet or just get rid of you entirely. One particular guy, he made, he said, "All right, I've liked your interview so far, but you're not going to get in this program unless you can make me mad." And so the guy's sitting there like, "Oh shoot, how do I make the admiral mad? I'm already sweating this interview process here." And then Rickover starts counting down.
Before he gets to 1, the candidate stands up, sweeps all the stuff off the admiral's desk, including a model of the Nautilus, which falls to the ground and breaks. Understandably, Rickover was absolutely furious, lays into the guy, but he got in. Another young candidate was engaged to be married in a few months' time, and he's talking to Rickover about how he wants to become a family man and a nuclear officer, and Rickover says, "Well, it's going to be a hard life. It's going to be very difficult to have both a family and be a nuclear officer. You're going to have to choose." And the candidate sat there, he thought about it. "I want to be a nuclear officer, sir." And then he says, "Okay, call your fiancée and tell her." So he stands up, he dials her number, gets her on the line, says, "Honey, we're going to have to postpone the wedding. I'm going to be a nuclear officer." And then he hangs up. Rickover immediately flies into a fury, stands up and says, and I'm censoring myself here, "You spineless yellow son of a gun. If you don't have the guts to stand up to me and can allow me to call off your wedding, you don't have the guts to be a nuclear officer. Get out of my office." And perhaps his most famous interviewee, a young Naval Academy graduate by the name of James Carter, sat down in front of the admiral. Now, James Carter had graduated near the top of his class, but not quite top, and they were talking about his academics. Now, Carter was pretty proud of it, and when Rickover asked him, "Did you always do your best?" he was about to answer yes, but he stopped himself. Stopped and he thought. And after a while, he said, "Well, no, sir, I don't think I always did." And as the story goes, Rickover turned his back on the future 39th President of the United States and said, "Why not?" But because of his integrity, Jimmy Carter became a nuclear officer. To this day, personal interviews with the Naval Reactors Director are still a requirement for all aspiring nuclear officers. My cousin can attest. While the discomfort levels do not reach those of Rickover, there are still curveballs worked into the process, and so Rickover would rule his roost for 3.5 decades, seeing his program of the nuclear navy grow and advance. While there has never been a significant nuclear accident in the history of the program, largely due to the adherence to policies that Rickover had put in place, it was not without tragedy and controversy. Most notable amongst these was the loss of the Thresher during post-commissioning testing. Though not a reactor accident, its loss with all hands caused the Navy and the nuclear program to severely scrutinize its quality assurance processes that were then in place. Through all of this, however, Rickover would tirelessly work to defend the program that he created. In 1982, however, Rickover's time was up. Concern over his age and mental abilities were on the rise, and finally the Reagan administration forced retired the admiral that had served over 63 years and under 13 presidents. One final blemish on his illustrious career would come to light following his retirement, when allegations were leveled at him over the receipt of gifts from General Electric and Westinghouse during his time at NR. Rickover did not dispute these allegations and even confirmed them, that he did in fact receive gifts from them, but he maintained that he never once allowed these gifts to influence decisions he made regarding his program. When asked about the scandal in an interview with 60 Minutes shortly before he passed, he claimed that his conscience was clear. Then Chief of Naval Operations expressed disappointment over the revelation, but encouraged the public to not let the transgression taint the decades of service that Rickover had given his country. So what is the measure of a man who dedicated his life to the service of the country he would come to call home, to which he advocated for the development of technologies both strategic and peaceful? While he was highly controversial, abrasive, and even a tyrannical leader, the capabilities he would bring the nation and the world are undeniable. And so, to take a short stock of some of what he accomplished, let's look at the fleet today. Currently, the U.S. Navy operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers with 3 more under construction and 68 nuclear submarines with 11 under construction. In total, in the past 75 years, 12 carriers, 214 submarines, and 9 cruisers, though 2 of them were technically considered destroyers, have been built and operated. He was the basis, or he created the opportunity to build the naval arm of the U.S. nuclear deterrence triad, originally dubbed 41 for Freedom, the initial boomers. We operate the largest carrier fleet in the entire world. We maintain a comprehensive quality assurance program that has fought the fallacy that the quality department is responsible for quality, rather than its proper responsibility of verifying that quality has in fact already been achieved. And lastly, his intense desire for high-quality training, producing critically thinking engineers and technicians, has ensured his program's legacy. Today, that dedication to training looks like this. Initial training for prospective engineers and technicians begins with intense classroom learning over a 6-month period in Charleston, South Carolina at NMPTC, Naval Nuclear Power Training Command, it's a mouthful, where trainees are taught about radiation, chemistry, mechanical and electrical principles, as well as reactor dynamics. For enlisted technicians, they also receive an additional 3 to 6 months of job-specific technical training focused on mechanical, electrical, or electronic systems. Following this is a 6-month hands-on training period where students learn by doing on one of 4 operational training reactors at either Nuclear Power Training Unit Ballston Spa or just down the road from NMPTC on Joint Base Charleston, over on the far side there. Now, that being said, I do believe one of those reactors has actually been decommissioned, though I haven't talked to my buddies recently to find out. The program is extremely challenging, fast-paced, and has a high turnover rate due to the mental demands of the program. The training doesn't stop there, and because technicians are, the training doesn't just stop there, as technicians and engineers are expected to continue to demonstrate their growing understanding of the plants they operate through quarterly or monthly exams. Due to the nature of the program, many sailors choose to only serve 1 or 2 tours before returning to the civilian world. And so this next part is dedicated to the men and women of the nuclear Navy who I have been a part of, both past, present, and as well as going into the future. We're not combat specialists, we're not frontline soldiers, we are technicians and engineers. And for the past 75 years, we have operated nuclear reactors safely with no major accidents. And this is a credit to the fine men and women of the program, as well as the exacting standards and continuous training instituted by Admiral Rickover. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that is a brief history of the Navy nuclear program. I hope you've enjoyed that. And now for something a little bit different. We have a little bit of a color change, so my pacing is going to change a little bit as well. So I've talked to you about the history, but what it is that we actually work with. I threw terms at you like atoms and criticality earlier, and let's take some time to talk about fission and the pressurized water reactors that we utilize in our systems. Everything that I'm about to mention is easily Googleable, and nothing is classified. So let's start back at the beginning. Excuse me while I get set up here. The atom. Uranium-235 to be specifically. As we know, the atom is made up of a highly dense, positively charged core made up of neutrons and protons, surrounded by a nebulous cloud of negatively charged electrons around it. Now, we know anything about electromagnetism. We know that positive doesn't like being next to positive, and negative doesn't like being next to negative. So how is it that we have this big bundle of positivity right here? Well, that's something called the strong nuclear force that holds it all together and is breaking this bond that we're going to exploit for our fission. And so that word fission, it implies the splitting of something. And so, by the way, this is adapted from a presentation I used to give to high schools. So if you see what are memes, that's why this was tailored towards a younger audience as I was trying to get them inspired for some of these technological programs. But here, the process of fission starts by shooting a neutron at a uranium-235 nucleus. So here we have our Momoa neutron about to impact our Henry Cavill uranium-235 nucleus. And when they collide, uranium-235 becomes uranium-236, a highly unstable isotope that doesn't like being uranium-236. It'll very soon split off into other particles, in this case barium-141 and krypton-92. Now those of you who are quick at math will realize 141 and 92 don't equal each other. So what are we missing? Well, we're missing the whole picture. When fission happens, a massive amount of energy is released, and neutrons will split off from it, as well as those fission products that I talked about previously. These neutrons will go on to cause a chain reaction, impacting other fissionable nuclei, creating what is called criticality. Now, who here has heard the term criticality before? All right. Most of the times it's probably in movies. There's blaring alarms, blinking red lights, and people running around losing their minds because the reactor has gone critical. In my line of work, a critical reactor is a good reactor. A critical reactor means stable power. A supercritical reactor means power is going up. A subcritical reactor means power is going down. The number of neutrons being created is the same as the number of fissions happening. But what we're truly concerned about is right here, that energy release. And so with that energy release, we create heat. Wrong direction. And so with a nuclear chain reaction, we need a way to control it. We'll get back to the heat in a second. So we control our nuclear reactors through these handy dandy components called control rods. Go figure. We are very creative when we come to name things. So these control rods are made of a neutron absorbing material that is able to keep neutrons from impacting uranium-235 nuclei. The further the core is inserted, or the control rods are inserted into a core, the less fissions are going on, the less power we have, or we can emergency shut them down by dropping the control rods all the way into the core. And so, time to make some science. What are we doing with that heat that I was talking about? Well, we have our nuclear coolant, which some people may think it's a glowing yellow fizzy liquid, but it's actually just water, hence pressurized water reactor. And so we're going to heat it up. But unfortunately, water likes to boil at 212 degrees, and this is where the pressurized portion of pressurized water reactor comes in. And so if you pressurize water really high, the boiling point also rises. And so somewhere on this scale is where we like to operate. And this is how we do it. we have a very aptly named pressurizer operating up here, and through a principle called Pascal's law, which states that a pressure change at any point in a confined, incompressible fluid is transmitted throughout the fluid such that the same change occurs everywhere. So effectively, if we cool the water down up here by spraying it with a little bit of cooler water, pressure is going to drop throughout the system. And if we heat it up using these heaters right here, pressure is going to rise throughout the system. So all this water is circulating through the core, being heated up by the fissions happening here, which are controlled by the control rods. All of that heat is then taken to what we call the secondary loop and generates steam in the very aptly named steam generator. And so inside the steam generator, steam is generated, passes through all these baffles because we want to get any moisture droplets out of there, and we want a very dry steam coming out of the top of this because water droplets are going to impinge upon our turbines and damage them. We don't want that. And so what does that steam do in our turbines? Well, we use it for electricity. That turbine's going to spinning a conductive material inside an electrical field, generating an electrical current. That electricity goes on to power our pumps, our communications and lighting, but most importantly, our ice cream machine and our coffee machine. We in the Navy do not run on anything other than ice cream and coffee, generally. By the way, I hope you're all enjoying the coffee you're having today. But that's not all we use that steam for. We use it to drift aircraft carriers. Have you ever seen a skyscraper drift through the water at over 30 miles an hour? I've been on one. So this was the primary reason why Rickover wanted to have nuclear power in the first place, to drive these massive engines, to drive these ships, and not have to worry about coal or diesel or whatever to have fuel their engines. And so once that steam goes through the entire system, goes through the turbines, it is exhausted. We call it exhaust. It passes over some tubes where seawater is flowing through. We send what leftover heat is there back to the ocean. And then that water goes back to the steam generator to start the entire cycle all over again. And so this is what it looks like all told. We have our heat source of the uranium-235 core being controlled by the control rods, making heat that we send to our secondary loop, which then generates steam, sends that steam over to our turbine generator to make our electricity, over to our main engine to propel the ship. That steam comes back down here, gets cooled off, and it all comes back to where we started. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a very, very rough crash course in the operation of a nuclear power plant on board a Navy vessel. And so I believe I have a little bit of a time. Oh, cool, I have about 5 minutes to talk to you a little bit about life on board a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. So this is a picture of the ship that I served on, USS George H.W. Bush, CVN 77. And now, let's talk about some size, right? Who has been to, first of all, do I have any Navy veterans here besides myself and my cousin? All right, no Navy vets, perfect. Who's been to New York? All right, who's seen the Empire State Building? All right. I want you to imagine the Empire State Building lying on its side. I want you to stack another one on top of that. Then I want you to put a 4.5-acre golf course on top of that with a 5-story house off to the side. And that is roughly the size of a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. Now imagine that running through the water at roughly 30 miles an hour or faster, potentially, with about 5,000 to 6,000 people on board and about 8 squadrons worth of aircraft. And now, for those of you sitting in this museum at this moment, I'm sure you've all walked through the museum, you've seen how big it is. This entire museum is roughly the size of one of the 4 compartments that makes up the propulsion plant of an aircraft carrier. So I just want you to let that sink in and how big this stuff actually is. But mine is just one perspective of 6,000 on board one of the 11 operational aircraft carriers that we have. And I'm sorry for any of my submariners out there who may be watching. You're having a skimmer talk to you about life on board a nuclear vessel, and I'm not even considering the submarines. My apologies. But I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that for the moment because I feel like I'm running up on time. There's so much that could be said about life on board an aircraft carrier. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to have any questions that you may have about the program, life on board a carrier, or I can try to talk about physics. Any physics questions, I might defer to my cousin over here. By the way, my cousin Connor, sitting right up here front, he is a nuclear trained officer, got out of the Navy just back in October. He was a lieutenant on board USS Florida, Blue Crew, right? Blue Crew, all right. So with that, I'll take any questions you got. Yes? Yeah, so that was, oh yes, so the question was, what was the year that nuclear power was first used on ships? And that was the USS Nautilus in 1955 with that initial voyage on January 17th. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, I saw her hand first, sorry. Fantastic question. So how long do we need to go before we have to refuel? For most aircraft carriers, the timeline is about 25 years before we need to refuel. An interesting thing about nuclear fuel, so the fuel cells are comprised of uranium pellets about the size of my pinky finger here, the tip of it, and each one of those pellets has the fuel or the energy equivalents of about 100 barrels of oil. And there's a lot of those things in that core. Sir, you had a question. Yes. Connor, what is the refuel period on Boomer?
Very similar.
Very similar, 25 years. So 25 years is what we're looking at for life expectancy on a core. Does anyone else have a question? Yes, Ron. Yes, they have found the Thresher. It is off the coast of one of the Canadian islands, I believe. That's something I will have to take as a lookup for more information, though. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Yes, there is waste, and that is something that is highly regulated. There are deep storage facilities around the world, not just for our waste, but for the world's nuclear waste. There are a whole bunch of nuclear reactors all over the place. I believe our primary waste facility is deep underground in New Mexico right now, but they're going to case it up in these large concrete and other insulative materials to keep everything safe and contained. I hope that answers your question, ma'am. Yes. Well, that depends on what level of nuclear waste it is. It can be anywhere from a few hours for very, very low level stuff to a few days, years, upwards to hundreds of thousands, even millions of years for some of the higher level stuff. And those are the things that we have very tightly wrapped and stored away very deeply. I hope that answers your question this time. All right, anything else? Yes, ma'am. Okay, so the fission products that are produced off of fission, sometimes they can serve either a negative purpose inside our core, or they're just kind of floating around there. Oftentimes, like what is considered nuclear waste, though, is anything that is potentially having been irradiated or just the spent fuel itself. And so the simple fact that it had fission operating within it as far as a core would constitute it following its service life as waste. But any like paper products that may have come in contact with some primary coolant, which is what we use to cool the reactor, that would also be considered nuclear waste. And that's like that low level stuff that I was talking about earlier. So I hope that answers your question. Sir, I saw your hand go up.
The program's underway to recycle.
I know that there are some recycling reactors that turn uranium spent uranium rods into other fuel sources for more modern kinds of reactors. Unfortunately, I am not up on all the current science and engineering behind it all, but I do know that there are facilities like that that are being researched and developed, as well as thorium reactors, which I believe hold a lot of potential for future applications on this stuff. Once again, though, any science like that, I'm aspiring to be a historian, not a. I left my technician stuff behind a long time ago. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Yeah, so we have, how's that? What I'm allowed to say is that our vessels are able to travel in excess of 30 knots. Yeah, is what I'm allowed to say. What I have seen is perhaps different, but that's for me to know and anybody who wants to join the nuclear program to find out. But where our ships are stationed, we do have several that are forward deployed in places like Guam and Japan. We have one carrier in Japan at least. I'm not entirely sure how many are maybe stationed at Guam. At the very least, there's a facility there for maintenance, but the big bases are going to be in Kings Bay, Georgia, where my cousin was stationed, just north of Jacksonville. I was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, where we have, how many carriers are there right now? Besides the 3 that are under construction, I think there's 4 there right now, but it varies. There's at least 1 or 2 undergoing maintenance there right now as well. But Bremerton and Everett, Washington are our sub and carrier bases there, and we also maintain facilities at Pearl Harbor for submarines, as well as San Diego, where at least 1 other carrier is based. I believe there may be a few attack submarines based elsewhere, but on the submarine side of things, I'm not the most up on. But they can travel anywhere there's water, and because of our safety record with nuclear power, we're able to go to almost any port in the world, and they will let us go there. I hope that answers your question, ma'am. Okay. Does anyone have anything else? Bob.
Do you know what are they doing with the reactor?
Actually, there are 8 reactors on the USS Enterprise. It was a little bit of an overkill when they designed that thing because they weren't entirely sure how the reactors were going to play with something that large. I'm not entirely sure what they're doing with that yet. That is something a little bit outside of where I've been for the past 2 years, so I will get back to you on that. I saw another hand go up over here. Yes, ma'am. Well, so communications is one of the things that says they need to come up. Food is often the most limiting factor, but personnel is also a limiting factor. I'm sure my cousin can attest, being underwater for a sustained amount of time is not exactly the most pleasant thing on one's psyche. So, but properly provisioned, we could stay under for quite a long time. Thankfully, I'm a skimmer. I was on a target, what the submariners like to call targets. I didn't have to worry about that. I could go upstairs and get some sun basically whenever I wanted. All right, does anyone else have anything for me? All right, then I think I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Keenan. Thank you all so much for listening to my talk today, and I hope you have a fantastic Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taylor, and thank you everybody for being here today. And thank you for being here all year, really. I mean, this is a joy for me to get to organize these talks, and you all showing up to these allows me to keep doing it more every month. So thank you very much to all of you for attending these, and once again, a reminder that we will be closed for our winter maintenance on December 30th until January 10th. So we will be closed to the public. But we also have some new things going on at the museum. If you are a member, please keep an eye on your inbox for news about our Egypt reopening next year in the new year. And then also we have our sale, which I mentioned earlier, 20% off merch and membership. And also January 16th, the next Coffee with the Curator. So thank you all very much, and have a wonderful Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Thank you.